Hello there, and welcome to the first episode of the NZ Deck Doctor series. I'm your Deck Doctor today, Zach, and in this series, I'm aiming to assist people with tuning up their decks for the NZ metagame. If you're interested in getting assistance improving your deck, whether you're a beginner trying to get your first deck put together, someone who maybe played as a kid and wants to upgrade their childhood deck to either include the new NZ cards or just be prepared to play other players on the server, or someone who's looking to fine-tune their deck for our main event tournament series, you can submit a deck list via an Octagon file in an email and send it over to nzdeckdoctor@gmail.com, or you can reach out to myself, Zach, on Discord. If you're in the NZ Discord, you'll be able to find me pretty easily. And when you do, make sure you include sort of a brief overview of both what the deck is trying to do, what the goals of the deck are, as well as what environment you're sort of trying to play the deck in. Is it more of a casual deck for pickup games, or is it something you're trying to bring to a tournament at some point in time in the future? That being said, the main sort of goal of the series is to keep the essence of the original decks that are submitted, but try to optimize the decks as much as you can within those constraints, basically. So building around interesting personalities or masteries that don't get played much, or different strategies that don't see much play is fun, but it's also more fun if those things actually get to do their thing and accomplish their stated goals, so to speak. So not every deck needs to end up getting boiled down to a boilerplate meta deck, but if you're going to go off the beaten path, choose to do something different. I personally like leaning into what makes that either that personality or that strategy different than a meta version of a deck in the same style, for example. I think taking that niche mindset is a good way to avoid a pretty common pitfall I see, which is building sort of a worse version of an existing meta deck just to play something off the beaten path, air quotes, but you just end up building the metagame deck that works. That being said, our first deck this week comes from Tim E. He's just getting into the game for the first time, basically, and he was interested in building a Torbie deck with our recently released NZ Torbie support card in NZ9, Torbie's Haymaker, as you can see on the screen. Because Tim's a new player, I really wanted to focus this first episode on teaching how I personally build like first versions of decks. Future episodes may be more focused on optimizing decks or metagame calls, things of that nature. But for this episode, I want to start on just learning how to build decks, sort of solid decks. If you are going to play Torbie, speaking about the deck, Torbie has really one thing going for him, which is his level 3. You really want to leverage this level 3. It's a huge energy attack, but it gets weaker the more and more cards are in your opponent's discard pile. So for that reason, our sort of main guiding through lines of the episode are going to be the main two focuses of the deck. It's going to be, number 1, get to level 3. Can't really use your level 3 power if you're not on level 3. And then number 2, we got to make the level 3 actually do the most damage it can by removing our opponent's discard pile from the game. So Tim selected the Black Calamity Mastery to go alongside Torbie. It's a relatively good choice. It has some synergy with Torbie for sure. Both Black as a style, which has a decent amount of cards that remove cards from your opponent's discard pile from the game. Additionally, the Black Calamity Mastery is a mastery that's very good at assisting you with gaining anger in a style that's only okay at gaining anger otherwise. It also has a cool interaction with the level 1 power, which is that it essentially turns your level 1 power into a sort of pseudo energy attack for 7 life cards, because you can replace the if successful ability with the replacement effect from Black Calamity Mastery, which basically turns that remove a single card if successful ability into milling them for 3 cards. So it can essentially do 4 life cards and 3 sort of unpreventable mill life cards. In general, with the Mastery, one thing to consider is that the mill effect will probably get used less often than in this deck than some other ones, because Torbie, obviously, once you get towards the point where you're getting to level 3, you really want their discard pile to be empty or as empty as possible. So that's something that when you're playing the deck, you will have to sort of learn on the fly the situations where maybe you can mill them for 3. But I would default, by and large, to mostly removing their discard pile when possible. That being said, we next have to basically decide, is this deck going to be a standard deck, or is it going to be a tough enough deck? Tim didn't really specify, so I'm going to start off with assuming this is going to be a standard deck. I think Torbie theoretically could be built for either format, and maybe he's slightly better in Tough Enough. There's a couple cards that you get in that format that help him out a little bit, but I think he can be built for either format, so we're going to focus on him as a standard build. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was Tim's Sensei deck choice, which is Pansy. Pansy, I think, is a very solid Sensei. It's a very good generic Sensei for a lot of decks, and I think it would work okay or plenty fine in this deck. But as I sort of alluded to in the opening, I like leaning into whatever the niche that our deck is trying to do is. And there's another Sensei that happens to align very heavily with that. It's going to be our new Marba Sensei. So this one lets you remove cards from your opponent's discard pile twice per game. Also, in some rare scenarios, you might mill them for 3 twice, which probably isn't advised, but in a pinch, you might end up in a scenario where that is a play that can actually win you the game. So that'll be the change that we're going to make to the Sensei, and maybe it turns out that Marba Sensei ends up being worse, but I think that as a starting point, I like to try to sort of go overboard with the support for the gimmick of the deck, so to speak. So this is supporting that main gimmick that we talked about. So next thing we need to talk about is the actual Sensei deck. These cards, honestly, are relatively random. And additionally, Marba Sensei only has 8 slots, so we're going to just end up deleting these for now. We're going to come back to the Sensei deck at the very end. That's also just generally how I build my decks, is I usually do Sensei deck towards the end, because you need to know what your main deck is bad against before you can even decide what your Sensei deck needs to help the main deck out. So, that out of the way, let's jump straight into the main deck. So, we're going to start by talking about cards to cut. If you're a new deck builder, you're naturally going to not have enough experience to know what all of the cards in the game are, or know what cards are staples or get commonly played. So we got to keep in mind when we're going through these cuts that Tim's a new player. His first deck he built from scratch by himself, as far as I'm aware. So this is a helpful experience from that perspective, but I hope that the sort of deck building philosophy that we'll talk about as we go along will help even more experienced players want to improve. So, the first thing is drills. So, this is something that may be just a gap in knowing the rules for Tim, but one important thing to know is that drills have a rule where if you level up while you have drills in play, you have to discard all of your drills. What that means is that because one of our stated goals is get to level 3, and you have to level up via the mastery and other effects in your deck, that means that all these drills you're working so hard to put into play, they're just going to end up immediately getting discarded whenever you advance a level. So, in general, as a rule of thumb, if you're trying to gain anger or advance levels via other means, I generally try to stay away from playing almost any drills unless they are so powerful that them being in play for 1 or maybe 2 turns is the sacrifice of losing them pretty quickly. That being said, I do want to quickly just touch on each of these drills individually to explain where they may be applicable, or if these are cards that you should just largely not play almost ever. So Huge Drill is in that latter category. So Huge Drill, if you're a new player, might look appealing because it's a damage buff, and then this other ability to stop unstoppable attacks seems useful. In reality, this is both a weak damage buff and an incredibly situational ability that even when it comes up, probably is going to be very minimal impact. There's really only 2 cards that are unstoppable attacks that see any play, which are Bone Seed Seeking Blast and then the level 1 High Tech Vinegar, and both of them are honestly very rare, even considering that they are playable. So I generally think that ability is mostly useless. And then the damage buff is about the weakest damage buff you can imagine. It's a physical attack that only does +1 power stage, and it buffs your physical attacks only for +1 power stage, not even your energy attack. So there are other, if we really wanted to damage buff drills, they're much stronger. Vegeta's Anger Drill is another card that is basically in the never play this camp. One thing to think about this card is, in our deck, I think we started off with about, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 drills, which are our only non-combats. One of them is a non-combat that is going to start the game in play, so it's not in your deck, and then one of them is the Vegeta's Anger Drill itself. So that means that when you play your first Vegeta's Anger Drill, if you have not lost any other non-combats, all you've done is effectively given yourself 10 more health, which is not very impactful. Additionally, it can be worse than that, because if it's halfway through the game and you draw your first Vegeta's Anger Drill, maybe it's only 4 more life cards effectively that you've given yourself. Also, sometimes if you get Endurance as your last card, it doesn't actually gain you the extra proverbial life card. So in general, this card is very bad. It's also bad in multiples, and even if you're playing a ton of non-combats, there are other better defensive drills, so we're going to be cutting that. Last in our drills that I would basically never play is Black Saving Drill. Worth noting, this has an errata that basically removes that last line of text, so you can ignore that, remove from the game after use part, but even with that gone, this card is very, very bad. The main thing to think about this card is that for this card to do anything, you have to be at exactly 3 or 4 anger. If you're at 5 anger, you level up and you lose this card entirely, and if you're at 1 or 2 anger, it doesn't do anything. So that's another reason to not basically ever play this card. It sort of has anti-synergy with itself, because it cares about anger. Black Imposing Drill. This drill is actually a solid drill. One important thing to note that you may or may not know as a newer player is that styled drills, you can only have 1 of each of them in play at a time. So you can only have a total of 1 Black Imposing Drill at a time. Now you can have other black drills in addition to this, but you can only have 1 of each individual black or red or Namekian, etc. drill in play at a time. So playing multiple of them can be dangerous because if you draw the second copy, it doesn't do anything. Black Imposing Drill, if you weren't leveling up, this is a card I would usually play 1 or maybe 2 of if my deck really wanted this effect, but in this deck, we're going to cut it. Caught Off Guard Drill. Again, we're leveling, so we're going to be cutting this card, but it is obviously a very good card. It's limit 1 per deck even. One important thing to know about this card is even if you were playing it in a deck that wasn't leveling, if you're a newer player, this card is very hard to use because you have to have a very good knowledge of the card pool, what cards your opponents are going to play. Additionally, if you're just playing this and just naming a generically good card in your opponent's deck, like for example, if you're naming Red Axial Kick, which is just a very strong red attack, I think you're going to, basically it's not worth using this card in that way. Caught Off Guard Drill is at its strongest when it's protecting other cards from the best card that your opponent has to deal with your other cards. If you're just using it to like generically negate a card that is good for them but not particularly bad for your overall strategy, it's a very weak card to be using in that way. And then the last one is Victorious Drill. This card we are going to likely keep, at least in the V1 of this deck, because it's a card that starts in play, and so you don't mind losing it because it didn't cost you anything to play. So generally I play this in every deck unless it's an ally deck. There's usually a little reason not to. Alright, so from the drills we're going to move on to 4 cuts, which are going to be the class of cards I would categorize as just generally weak or maybe bad cards that you basically don't ever want to play. And so we're going to go through these, and like I said, Tim's a new player, so this is a learning experience for him, but it's going to be helpful with understanding why these cards are weak. So we're going to go through them. The first one is Black Lunge. Hilariously, this card is pretty expensive as far as I know because it's like kind of an obscure promo, but it's a really weak effect. It's only a small damage attack. It's +3 life cards physical, so this is going to do some life cards and some power stages, which is kind of a weird split. Additionally, it just raises your anger a single time, which is a pretty weak effect. So we're going to cut Black Lunge. It doesn't really help our deck that much other than the tiny amount of anger. Nope, that is not part of that. So next up is Black Wrist Block, Black Defensive Stance, and Black Defensive Aura. All 3 of these are basically similar to one another. They are what we call Omni Blocks for players. They can block a physical attack or an energy attack. These are cards that are basically outclassed by other black cards that you're not already playing. Black Aura Eruption is one of those cards, but there's even more that are better than this that you're not playing. So even if we did want this many Omni Blocks, which we might not, there are just better ones. Black Defensive Aura notably is particularly bad because it costs you a power stage, which you basically never want your defensive cards to cost power stages, because if you run out, you can't play them and you're going to get beat down. I'm going to cut all 3 of those. Next is Black Hand Energy Blast. So this is a card that this is just a generic attack that does a little bit of life cards and a little bit of stages. If you really wanted an effect like that in black, you would rather play Black Four-Fist Punch, which is an energy attack that does 6 life cards in 3 stages. This does 3 and 2, and the 1 endurance will not make up for that fact. That being said, I don't think we even want that type of effect in our deck. This is just a generic attack that does damage, but also it splits it across life cards and stages. Our deck doesn't really care about that, so we're going to get rid of that one. Next up is Black Mutilation. This is a card that probably maybe doesn't belong in the category of generally weak cards, but it is a card with a very big drawback. The effect is powerful if you land it, but especially because physical attacks, people tend to play more physical blocks than energy blocks. Black Mutilation hits way less often than its counterpart in Black Chaos Detonation, and on top of that, it has a pretty big drawback. So I tend to not play this card because the drawback is so severe that it ends up being a detriment, in my opinion, so we're going to cut it. Next, I want to actually skip down a little bit to a couple cards, which is Black Side Block and Black Forearm Block. These are basically the same card. They're both blocks that raise your anger 1, and with the mastery makes them gain an additional anger. But if you notice, you're only playing 2 black sidekicks, and this is the same card as those 2 cards, but it's just better. It gains you 2 anger instead of 1. Additionally, we probably are going to end up not playing quite as many blocks as this, and if we wanted more physical blocks, we can go looking for more. Keep in mind that we'll talk about later, we actually have a bunch of black attacks that also block physical blocks, block physical attacks. So we have black body destruction, and we have Black Turning Kick, both of which are cards that block physical, so we're gonna probably not end up wanting that many blocks in the grand scheme of things. So we're gonna cut both of these. Then the last few cards in this category, Hercule's Dropkick. This is a card that's similar to the black card that does life cards and stages that I've already forgotten the name of, Black Hand Energy Blast. Similar to that, this has another counterpart that's just basically better, which is Power Overwhelming. This is a card that just does 2 more damage, and it gains you the 3 stages regardless of whether or not they block it. It doesn't go back on the bottom of your deck, but that's honestly a pretty minimal benefit. This is also notoriously a card that you end up cutting from a lot of lists because you have a ton of synergy with a lot of masteries, and as a result, it's hard to justify playing it if it doesn't do anything with your mastery, unless you just desperately need a big Unga Bunga attack. This deck is probably also going to be more life card of damage based than stages of damage based, which we'll talk about it towards the latter half of the deck building process. So just having a big physical attack that does a lot of stages, not really what this deck's in the market. Card that I've already lost, yep, Dropkick. Okay. Last on the list in this category is Black Side Thrust. This is a very weak effect that a lot of players gravitate towards because they like sniping individual cards out of their opponent's deck. There are much better cards that do that in black. So, for example, Black Searching Technique, which is also a card I wouldn't play in this deck, but this card hits 2 cards and it removes them from the game. Now, this is an attack, but it's a very weak attack, especially because Torbie is like not a particularly powerful physical attacker on the attack table. Additionally, this card only discards the named card, and it only gets 1 copy of it, which is generally very low impact. In fact, it can oftentimes be a detriment because they can just get the card back out of their discard pile with an effect that retrieves discarded cards. So more often than not, this card's barely worth using, and similar to Caught Off Guard Drill, you have to have a very good knowledge of your opponent's deck for this to do even that much, which is not a lot, so we'll be cutting that. And that is the last of the cards that I would say just generally don't play those cards in almost any deck. There may be an exception, but by and large, those cards are pretty weak, maybe with the exception of Black Mutilation, which we talked about. Okay, the next category are cards that are not necessarily bad cards, but that aren't maybe that good in this deck. Or maybe there's better versions of these cards that you aren't already playing. The first one here is Black Sweeping Strike. There's other cards that do very similar things to this that you're not playing. So one example would be Black Dropkick. The Black Dropkick can potentially discard even more cards than Sweeping Strike. Another one would be Black Face Slap. Is another card that is almost the exact same as Black Sweeping Strike. It does 1 less power stage of damage, but in return it gets to be focused, which means that it's going to discard cards in their hand a little more consistently, and the discarded card's random, which is better. So I think generally you would play this over Sweeping Strike if you're going to play one at all. And then the last one that's in this camp is Swivel Attack. Now, Swivel Attack notably doesn't discard cards, it removes them, which is normally better, but in the context of black and black buffer block, you might say is slightly worse. But this one's not if successful, which is incredibly strong. That being said, for now, we're just going to cut this one, because I think if we wanted this effect, we would play one of those 3 cards likely. Next on this list of good cards that we're not playing because they don't fit our deck is Stop. Stop is a card that is mostly a control card. We're going to be a lot more aggressive than that, and doesn't really have that much synergy with our Mastery. Other than, I guess, you can mill them for 3 instead of making them discard their hand. I don't like playing random combat enders outside of maybe Earthbreaking Ball 7 and Sand Truce card, which is calling that card a combat ender is probably a little disingenuous. So Stop is a card that I generally only play in really controlled decks. Next is maybe blasphemous for some people on the server, Spear Defense. I don't ever like playing this card in decks that are not really controlling and aren't trying to build a board. Very similar to Caught Off Guard Drill, where Caught Off Guard Drill I like playing in decks that are trying to protect specific things. Similarly, Pure Defense I like playing in decks trying to protect key cards. If you're just pure defensing a random card with a decent secondary effect, it's really not worth the slot in my opinion. It does draw a card and replace itself, but it also makes your hands a little ambiguous as to how good or bad they are. Because, for example, if you draw a hand that's like 1 attack, 1 pure defense, and 1 block, you enter with that hand, maybe you have an extra attack lying around from a previous combat, but probably not. And then if you don't enter combat, are you keeping the pure defense? What if you don't draw a block next turn? It's a really weird card in more aggressive decks because it can slow your momentum down by making your hand very unclear how good or bad it is. And then if you decide not to enter, you give up a little bit of momentum. And then also it can, if you end up keeping it, it can really make future hands even more ambiguous because maybe you don't draw block alongside the pure defense. Then your pure defense might not do anything. So I don't really like this card in more aggressive decks for that reason. Alright, the last card on this list is Black Planet Destruction. This is another card that I think a lot of people on the server might raise an eyebrow at cutting. It's a really strong card, big focus energy attack for 6 life cards. Additionally, and this is a rule that's important to know for newer players who are playing Calamity Mastery. So Calamity Mastery says your black style physical energy combat cards that can stop attacks gain Raise Your Anger 1. That means that even if you are not using them currently to stop an attack, if they have the ability to do it in some circumstances, like Black Body Destruction can, like Black Turning Kick can, and like Black Planet Destruction can, then even if you use them as an attack, you still get to raise your Anger 1 off your Mastery. So for that reason, it does have some synergy. Main reason we're cutting this card is that it's going to end up clashing with another card we're adding later on. One of the most important cards in our deck is going to be a Battleground, and this card is not optional to discard it if you play it. So that if you have your own Battleground in play, you're going to have to discard it in order to play this card. So I generally would avoid that because of how important the Battleground will be to our strategy. That's it for the cuts. So let's quickly jump through all the cards we're keeping. We're also going to top off these black sidekicks, which we kind of alluded to earlier. This card is a very strong effect with Calamity because it gains you anger. So first is Torbie's Haymaker. You're definitely playing this card in Torbie because that's the whole reason to. It's notably a black energy combat card in this deck. It's really good because a lot of your cards are going to end up being black energy combat cards, and it has Transform. It also does 5 life cards, which Torbie's going to prefer life cards of damage. Raises your Anger 2. We already talked about really want to get to level 3, and this makes it so that for the rest of the combat, all of your attacks do life cards of damage, are removing them from the game instead of going to the discard pile, so obviously really good. Victro we've talked about. Black Aura Eruption. Great card, raises your anger off of your Mastery. Also, it removes cards from your opponent's discard pile from the game, which is the name of the game, as we talked about. So it does both parts of the overarching themes of getting to level 3 and removing discard pile cards. And then also in a pinch, you can also mill 3 off your opponent's your Mastery if the situation is better for that. So great card. Black Sidekick we talked about. Effectively a 3 anger block in black with the Mastery. Notably, it also breaks the anger raises up. So if this card just raised your anger 3 with the Mastery straight up, then if you're already at 3 or 3 anger, then you would end up on your next level, but you would have no additional anger because the anger doesn't roll over. But because it adds the line of text raise your anger 1 at the end, what happens is You raise your anger 2, then you level up if you're on 3 or more anger, then you raise your anger 1 from the mastery. So it allows you to get an extra anger out of that. Which Black Negation, you're going to play the negations in basically every deck. Trunks makes himself clear, raise your anger 2, seems good to me. Black Chaos Detonation maybe doesn't explicitly have synergy, or at least not obvious synergy, but it's really good with your level 3 power because it gives them a conundrum. If you lead the combat on the Chaos Detonation, it's an energy attack, which is the same as your level 3 power, and you basically say to your opponent, hey, do you want to block this? Because if you don't, you're holding on to your 1 energy block to block my power later, and that's going to probably be the only card in your hand left. So that's a really powerful effect in my opinion. Chaos Detonation, or rather, Black Vegeta's Gallic Gun. Basically playing this in every black deck because it's so versatile. It hits both non-combats and allies, both of which are really important to be able to get rid of. Definitely playing it. Time is time. Play this in every deck. Spheres, you're likely going to end up playing 2 of these. The 2-1 split between Sphere and Negation is pretty common. I have shaved this from many decks, but I think in Standard it's relatively justified to keep it in there because if you play a very stasis-heavy deck that tries to end combat a lot, Sphere's a really good card to have access to. Battle Pausing is really good with cards like Chaos Detonation, to be able to reuse them, so I think it's a reason to include. Body Destruction, probably the single most played black card, I would say, in every version of black. In your deck, it's likely going to more often be a block than an attack, which is fine. It also raises your anger 1 off your mastery, which we talked about, and getting rid of random cards. Maybe you get rid of your opponent's energy block, and then your power gets to hit them pretty consistently. That's a good effect. Black Turning Kick. This card, similar to Black Sidekick, raises your anger 2 times, one and 1. Also, this is just like Body Destruction, an attack or a block, which is very, very flexible, and it raises your anger 2 in both scenarios. Black Defensive Burst is probably the most generic card that we have in this deck. I think it's going to be solid because we're going to likely have many energy attacks in our deck because Torbie tends to like energy attacks more than physical attacks because he's a weak physical attacker. So having a physical attack that does life cards, which is good, and then also it puts them in a situation where if they don't block it, then maybe they have Omni blocks in their hands, that clears the way for your mastery, or for your level 3 power, I should say. And then additionally, having your power stages protected, if it hits them, is really strong. Boost Prep Crash, this is probably the quintessential Torbie card, I would say. If it hits them, it removes their discard pile from the game. That's exactly what your level 3 wants. Additionally, it also gives you a cheeky 1 anger, which is good because it helps get up to the level 3. Nothing not to like there. And then the last card is Gloria Draw of Steel. Very similar to Prep Crash, but just a little less effective at removing cards from their discard pile. Notably, this also counts as a black energy combat card in your deck, which does synergize with your Haymaker, your Aura Eruption, and your Gallic Gun for transforming. So that's good as well. Alright, that's the cards we're keeping, which, hey, it's about half the cards in the deck, so not a bad start from Tim. The next thing we are going to talk about are the adds. We've already added our first card here, which is Black Side Thrust. The next thing we're going to add, and this is something that if you're newer to NZ cards in particular, you just may not have even known existed, but Torbie is a pretty cool guy because he is one of the Celestial Fighters. So as a result, he gets to play one of our Celestial Fighter support cards in Celestial Halo. So, alright, so yeah, Celestial Halo, this is a card that works only with Celestial Fighters. It's a card that starts the game in play, similar to Victoria Stroll. And when you, at the beginning of the game, you get to search for this card and attach it. Then this does 3 things. You get to search for a Grand Kai ally. So we're going to add this to the deck, and we're going to add a Grand Kai. Talk about it in a second. And you get to put Grand Kai in play, so that's a really strong effect because it lets you protect your power stages early in the game by redirecting damage to Grand Kai, or in some circumstances the opposite, where you use Grand Kai's Z power stages as a way to make your opponent's big physical attackers like Majin Buu or Brawly do way less damage because Z sets all of the attacks on the physical attack table to 2, no matter who is attacking or blocking. And you can do things like use Grand Kai in combat to calculate the damage, and then you can redirect the damage back to poor Torbie and take life cards of damage, but it's a lot less total damage that way. Additionally, this card does another cool thing, which is it protects you from getting what we call 1 through 3 MPBB cheesed. So in the game, if you are, again, aiming this towards newer players like Tim, if you only have 3 levels and you reach, and your opponent only also has 3 levels, and either of you reach level 3, you win by most powerful personality victory. Now, if either of you have a level 4, then only the person that has the level 4 or the level 5 can win that way, because you have to have the highest or tied for the highest level in the game between the 2 players. What Celestial Halo does is it basically says you are considered to have sort of a ghost level 4 for the purposes of your opponent's winning by MPVP. So if your opponent wants to win by MPVP, they have to get all the way to level 4, whereas you only need to get to level 3, assuming that they only have 3 levels themselves. So that's a good effect. And then lastly, your attacks do +1 life card. What's not to like there? Grand Kai, in addition to all of that, he gives all your attacks an extra power stage, and he doesn't need to be in control of combat for that to be relevant. So we're going to add both of those because we're a Celestial Fighter, and that's kind of the point. Next category is just staple cards that basically go in almost every deck. So we're going to start off with the non-combats. Fatherly Advice. This is basically the equivalent of Demonic Tutor, if you're familiar with that. Searches for any card. Really, really powerful effect. Expectant Trunks might actually be slightly better, because this one is basically a higher tempo version of Fatherly Advice. I guess this would be like Rebirth and Magic if you're familiar with Magic. But it's really, really solid because it often will get in a similar card, quality card to Fatherly, because by the mid to late game you have a lot of cards in your discard pile oftentimes. But additionally, this card gets to be used when entering combat, meaning you don't have to waste an action to use it. Now, one thing to note, and we're going to touch on this later, there's going to be a card we're adding to this deck, or maybe even 2, that make this card worse than it would otherwise be. There's a chance that when you play this deck, you end up finding this card's a little clunky because of that. There's an outside chance this might be one of the 3% of decks that are not supposed to play Expectant Trunks, but I think that it's so powerful in the scenarios where it's good, probably worth the lack of synergy with another card we're going to be adding later. Next on our list of staples you almost play are the Stop Alls. So, yeah, Nappa's Physical Resistance. Now, again, with Tim being a newer player, and maybe some other newer players just don't realize this, because this actually comes up as a question sometimes, these are old Saiyan Saga cards from the very first set of the game. They are worded really, really weirdly. So this card really heavily implies that you have to be Nappa for this card to work. That's not the case. It just basically says stop a physical attack and then stop all other physical attacks performed against you for the remainder of combat. Similarly, Nappa's Energy Aura works the same way for energy attacks, and then Nappa's Physical Resistance, or Vegeta's Physical Stance, is basically the same card as Nappa's Physical. These are basically cards you play in every single deck. They're all limit 1 per deck, so we're going to play all 3 of them. Then we're going to play Super Saiyan Effect, which is sort of the honorary 5th Stop All. This card is not a Saiyan card, because the Saiyan is the second word, not the first word. And then this one can be better than the other physical Stop Alls, because it even prevents your opponent from even playing them. And so they can't even use secondary effects of them. And then the last staple, by the way, Time is Warrior still will be the last of these effects that you're going to play in every deck, but you already got that one in there. Then we got Confrontation. So most decks will play Confrontation at 3 copies, or if you're a villain, you'll play Enter at 18 Stare Down at 3 copies. I would say maybe less than these other cards that are probably in 95+% of decks. These are probably like 90 to 85%. Stare Down is usually a better option in black specifically. Generally, I view these 2 cards as interchangeable, because for all intents and purposes, they do mostly the same thing. In black in particular, there are cards that synergize with discarding cards specifically from your opponent's hand. So Stare Down is stronger, but we're not a villain, so we don't get to do that. That is okay. We'll play the Confrontation. It's still strong enough worth playing. Okay, so those are the play them in almost every deck cards. Next, we're going to jump to our anti-control or anti-stasis cards. These are cards that if you are remotely aggressive, you probably have to play usually, and we'll kind of go over that in a moment. So Majin Buu's Fury. So Majin Buu's Fury is a card that is mostly there because of stasis decks that like to end combat, or control decks that like to play lots of non-attacking actions during combat. Majin Buu's Fury basically says, if on your attack phase, you can only attack. That's the only option you got. So this card is great. Now, it does have some anti-synergy with stuff like Confrontation in our deck, or Battle Pausing, but this card is so strong against the decks that it's good against that you probably play it. Another thing worth noting is that if you're in a scenario where this effect is kind of like whatever, maybe your opponent's also very aggressive and doesn't really care about the floating effect, then you just play this as your last attack. And you either use it to raise your anger 1 and play it as your last attack, or you can play it earlier but empower it so it does 2 more life cards, and you don't have to worry about the second half of the card. We'll play that at 3 copies. This is sort of an Eat Your Wheaties card that you just kind of have to play in your deck most of the time if you're attacking, because the basis decks are so powerful that you need a lot of tools to deal with them. The next on this list is Piercing Beam. So Piercing Beam is a new NZ card that is basically the energy version of Gohan's Kick. In fact, it literally is the energy version of Gohan's Kick. And you can't play more than 3 of them total due to the parenthetical on Piercing Beam. So we're going to play the energy one because Gohan's Kick is a weak physical attack. You're a weak physical attacker in general, so I would prefer to play the energy attacking version. There is some consideration for playing Gohan's Kick. There's some synergy with kick cards in black, but I think the energy attack is a little solid in our deck. You play this card obviously because you don't want your opponent to end combat, and then also in a pinch it can prevent them from stopping all your attacks, which is slightly less important but in this deck than other decks, because you kind of have ways to get around that, but you need it for mostly that combat ending effect. Alright, next is going to be sort of the core pillar of this deck, which is going to be Dying Planet. We talked about this earlier. Dying Planet is our battleground. Now, this is sort of an important deck building lesson that I wanted to talk about, which is that most of the time you want to play a battleground or a location in your deck at 3 copies. Because the current metagame is so heavily revolving around really powerful battleground and location effects, that the idea is that your deck is built to not care about the battleground or the location, and it's going to negatively affect your opponents. So because so many games involve the battleground, the war for the battleground or location slot, keep in mind that if you play a battleground or location, if another one comes into play, it replaces the one in play and removes the game. So the best way oftentimes to get rid of their battleground is to play your battleground location. Dying Planet has obvious synergy with our deck because it moves their discard pile from the game, basically until it gets removed. Dying Planet obviously doesn't get rid of cards that are already in the discard pile when you play it, but if you get it down early, it's going to be extremely consistent at making your level 3 power do 15 life cards all the time, which is great. So definitely adding 3 of these, and in the right area. Right. Next up. Okay, so next we're going to do a little assessment because we got some cards added. We want to quickly kind of visualize how many cards we have that are achieving our 2 original pillars of this deck, which are get to level 3, remove their discard pile from the game. We want to see where we're at with both of those. So, for removing our opponent's discard pile, we got Torbie's Haymaker, 4 copies. We got 3 Kid Boost Prep Crashes. We got 3 Gloria Draw Steel. We got Black Ore Eruption, and we have our Marba Sensei. And then obviously we have the 3 Dying Planets we just added. So that adds up to 18 cards, including the Sensei, which is solid. Then we want to talk about leveling up. This is something where, for sort of reference, black, or rather red, usually red, MPPV decks that are trying to get to level 5 and win via MPPV, they often play between, I would say, like 85 to 100 plus anger their deck total. So we're going to keep that in mind. Now we're only trying to get to level 3. Should be easier, but you still can't slack too much on the anger because you don't gain it in chunks in one combat. Then you risk things like your opponent's Victorious Drill, cutting your anger down, just random anger lowering effects, and it can make it so that you really stall out on like level 2 you don't want. So total anger, I counted up, I believe it is about 37 anger or so. That includes things like Haymaker, that raise your anger 2. This also counts things that raise your anger 1 off of your mastery that don't normally gain anger. So like Black Ore Eruption counts as a 1 anger card in our deck, even though it doesn't actually gain anger on the card, because it makes our mastery gain us an anger. And then cards obviously that do gain anger, but also work with the mastery, I counted them. I counted the extra anger on them. So right about 37, 38 anger if I recall correctly. So next, let's talk about blocks, because we did cut quite a few blocks, and we kind of alluded to there being better ones. Now, I think we had too many blocks to start with, especially because some of our attacks are also blocks, and some of our other attacks, while they're not explicitly blocks, they kind of have defensive implications, like Chaos Detonation, so or Defensive Burst. So we're going to add a few blocks. There's 4 I'm considering, so let's go through them real quick. The first one's going to be Protection Orb. This is just like an additional Nappa's Energy Aura, kind of. And additionally, it raises our Anger 1 off of our Mastery. Once the game starts, Black doesn't really care about what's in its Sensei deck anymore, other than against Red. But usually that's worth this. This basically stops like 5 energy attacks in one combat, which is effectively a stop all. We're going to play that. Also raise our Anger 1. Next is going to be Rear Spin Kick. So this is sort of the sister card to some of the Cell Saga physical blocks that raise your Anger 1. The reason we're going to play this one is because we need another energy block, because we have mostly physical blocks with our Body Destruction, our Turning Kick, and our Side Kick. So this is an energy block that effectively raises our Anger 2. And the word kick also has some synergy with Black, which we're going to talk about later. So we'll add 3 of these. And then it comes down to Omni blocks. So there are 2 that we can consider. You might play both, but I think we're going to only end up playing 1. We'll talk about the one that most people would play first. Now, we're going to talk about a card that I think we're not going to play, and I'll tell you why. So this card is great. This is Black Buffer Block. If Black Body Destruction is the most played Black card, this is probably the second most commonly played Black card, I would say. It's very strong because obviously it retrieves cards like Body Destruction, like Chaos Detonation. Notably in our deck, those are currently the only cards that this works. We'll probably have maybe 1 or 2 more, but we actually don't have very many of these effects. If we were a villain and we got to play Android 18 Stare Down, that's another card that you very consistently get into your discard pile all the time and can rebuy with Buffer Block, but we don't because we're heroes, so we can't play Stare Down, we have to play Confrontation. As a result, I actually think we're going to play a card that is generally worse in most decks, but I think leans a little bit more into our theme. We talked about that at the beginning of the, lean into the gimmick of the deck. I like doing that at least in first drafts of decks as much as we can, even if it means cutting some sacred cows like Buffer Block. So we're going to lean into that. We're going to play Black Foreboding Weather. So this card has the parenthetical: when you enter combat, you can reveal it from your hand, make them remove cards in their discard pile from the game. That obviously synergizes with Torbie. Also, it synergizes with the Mastery, because early in the game, you maybe don't remove cards and you just mill them for card from your hand, and you don't even have to play it. One important thing to note with this card is that the way your entering combat effects work, you have to use your when entering combat effects on defense first before you draw your 3 cards when entering as the defender. So that means that you already had to have this in your hand to reveal it. You can't draw it in your 3 and then retroactively reveal it. On offense, obviously, you draw at the beginning of your turn, so you're going to have it in your hand before you even get to combat. So Foreboding Weather is also just a solid block in general. Stops a physical and an energy attack. It's now an energy combat card, meaning it does trigger your Mastery. It used to be a combat card. Also, it's a black energy combat card, which means you can discard it to all of your transform effects in this deck. So I think it has slightly more synergy, so we're going to try it. Maybe you end up playing Buffer Block, but we're going to play Foreboding Weather at 3 cost. Okay, those are all the extra blocks. With the extra blocks added, we got another 9 anger, so I think we're around 47 anger at the moment. But a lot of that anger is in reactive effects, meaning that, if your opponent doesn't have attacks, you can't really gain anger off of those cards. As a result, we're going to add 1 more card that is in the same category as some of the other cards we talked about earlier, which is the Black Knife Hand Strike. This one is a energy for 4 or stops an energy attack. It's a little weaker than something like Turning Kick, because Turning Kick is 1 more damage and physical attacks are a little bit more common than energy attacks, and it raises your anger 1 natively. This is only going to raise your anger once off of your Mastery, but it's also an attack, meaning that you can play it, again, proactively and still raise your anger 1 off your Mastery. We're going to play 3. That also gives us another energy block as well. Alright, so with all of those, so I think we're at, 50-ish anger, if I recall correctly now. Let's move on to more generic black cards that maybe aren't explicitly synergizing with our mastery, but are usually strong enough to play anyway. So we're going to go to Black Roundhouse. This card does have a little bit of synergy, Raise Your Anger 1. It also retrieves cards with kick in the title from your discard pile to your hand. We got our Black Rear Spin Kick that we just added. You got your Black Turning Kick that we talked about, and your Black Side Kick. Also, a lot of these cards raise your anger, so you can use Black Roundhouse plus Black Turning Kick to raise your anger 3. If they're a physical attacking deck, you get Black Side Kick, you can raise your anger 4. Very strong effect. That's also why we picked this specific black energy block. It has kick in the title. There's also a couple more cards later we might consider adding that have kick also. This, by the way, this card is a reason why you might play Gohan's Kick instead of playing Piercing Beam, but I think Piercing Beam is a little bit better in our deck. One other thing is that Roundhouse is a little bit of a weak attack in the context of Torbie, because our attacks are leaning more energy heavy. And so as a result, this is kind of a weak attack as an attack, but its utility is so strong that I think it's worth it. Next is going to be, let's see, okay. Yes, so next is going to be Black Exertion. This again is kind of a staple black card that almost every deck's going to play. It's a relatively large energy attack if you empower it for 7 total, but also if the first one you get to attach your opponent's mastery or personality and then prevents them from preventing damage. This can turn off entire decks like Black World Games or Black Majin Buu Saga Mastery or Saiyan World Game Saga Mastery. Also decks with lots of endurance that's really hoses, which can be really strong. So definitely play these. And lastly, to pair up with our Black Defensive Burst, we're going to play its sister, Energy Web. Black Energy Web. So Black Energy Web is a big energy attack. If successful, stops them from performing energy attacks in your combat. Sadly, this does not trigger off of the mastery because it's a card effect that just prevents them from playing cards. It doesn't actually stop attacks, similar to Black Defensive Burst, but it has a lot of really strong ability to make it so your opponent maybe has to block this instead of your power, for example, if they're an energy attacking deck as well. So, and it's just a big chunky attack on top of that. So usually most black decks will end up finding room for this if they can. That is all of the generic things. So let's talk a little bit more about anger. First one I want to add is a card called Black Front Kick. So this is another kick card to go with our Roundhouse. And it's an energy attack for life cards. It is a very costly one. It costs 4 stages, but raise your anger 2. We do need more anger in this deck, as I alluded to earlier. Next, we're going to go with Black Hug Maneuver. Black Hug Maneuver is a card that, especially in this deck, but even in most decks, it basically just is a very, very weak attack. It really doesn't do much damage, but it does raise your anger 2. So we are going to add that. In a pinch, you can rarely get this to raise your anger 3 as well. And last one is Feudal Effort. This one I think is the weakest of these 3 cards in general. You really only play this if you really, really want anger, because if you want to get the maximum amount of anger out of the deck, it doesn't do any damage. But it's strong enough effect anger-wise that I think it's worth playing, at least in the first version of the deck. So with all of those added up, I think we are now up to 71 anger or so. As I alluded to earlier, MPPV decks run 90 plus oftentimes, so we're not quite there, but we're only trying to get to level 3, and we're already over the deck limit. We're going to have to cut some cards, so we're going to end up needing to shave that down regardless, so we can't really fit much more in the way of anger. There are a couple more cards I was interested in at least trying in the first version of the build that we need to consider. The first one is going to be A Hero's Heart is Strong. This is a card that generally sees no play. These are the same card, by the way. This is the current accurate text, but the word Sensei deck really doesn't have much game meaning anymore because you can play any card in your Sensei deck. So you can play either one of these as the same card. A Hero's Heart is Strong is not usually a commonly played card because it is an on-combat, it's a little clunky. But with Torbie, there are plenty of other cards that remove cards in your opponent's discard pile from the game. There aren't that many that get them all. This one gets all of them, which is really huge. Now, this also removes your own discard pile from the game. So we kind of talked about some anti-synergy with Dying Planet and Transform effects, which is unfortunate. Expect in Trunks. But I think that these are so important to have access to in the context of Torbie's level 3 power that we're willing to deal with a little bit of anti-synergy because the payoff is so big. Okay, so that is kind of one more card I wanted to at least consider was Gregory. This is a card that normally is a King Eye support card, but both your level 1 and your level 3 power are really strong if they're focused. On level 1, you're doing basically a focus energy attack for 7 on your level 1 when combined with your mastery. And then Torbie on your level 3, obviously making that focused really strong. Keeping in mind that a lot of times people skimp on pure energy blocks and play more omni blocks to try to cover their energy weaknesses. Now that may change because of how many focus energy attacks and maybe energy attacking decks are a little more common now, but that is a pretty common experience you'll run into. So focus energy attacks are notoriously the most difficult sort of common type of attack that you need to block. And making your powers focuses can be really strong. So we'll try to add Gregory as well. Okay, so we are currently at 90 main deck cards. Add that together with our 5 starting deck cards. We are at 95, which means we need 10 cuts. I also wanted to quickly break down sort of the breakdown of our deck. We talked earlier about attacks that are dealing life cards versus stages. This is sort of a deck building philosophy I like to think about. A lot of people think about it in terms of an energy attacking deck or a physical attacking deck. I think it's more useful to think of it in terms of attacks that do life cards directly versus stages. So the main concept is that if you split your attacks sort of evenly between the power stages and energy attacks, you'll often find yourself in situations where your physical attacks don't actually do that much damage. Because, for example, let's say you have as one of your one of your attacks is a black body destruction, one of your attacks is a black turning kick, and you're planning on using them both as attacks. When you attack with the body destruction, the +4 power stages, especially with Torbie, who's a relatively weak MP, you might only knock them down to halfway, and then it doesn't actually do any life card. And then your black turning kick does do life cards directly. So really, the only reason you're playing black body destruction as an attack, if you are split down the middle, is because you want the utility. Because if you don't draw multiple physical attacks to actually get to the point where they're out of power stages entirely, they can't play any more energy attacks, you're denying them that resource, and you actually start racking up damage. So generally speaking, it's better to have more of a heavy skew towards one or the other, and then you generally only play, like if you're mostly power stages of damage, only play the energy attacks that have really powerful effects on them that are really needed for your deck, and then vice versa. If you're mostly an energy attacking deck, you might only play really powerful physical attacks that have effects that are really integral to your deck strategy or have a lot of synergy otherwise. So like, for example, Black Roundhouse would be an example of a very weak attack in this deck, but it does retrieve a lot of cards that gain us anger, and so it has a lot of utility for that reason. It's probably worth playing. So earlier I checked to see our breakdown. We have 38 life card attacks, which is going to be mostly our damage. We have about 15 power stage attacks, which are mostly there for their utility or their secondary effects. Our block breakdown is 26 total blocks. That includes 9 attacks that are also blocks, so that's like body destruction and turning kick, for example. Also, we have 9 attacks that have like defensive implications, like chaos detonation and defensive burst and energy web. So that's another sort of supplementary effects that we have. And we have around 71-ish anger, if I recall correctly. And we're up to 23 cards that remove cards from our opponent's discard pile from the game. So those are sort of the categories we're working with when we're considering cuts. The next thing we want to consider is anti-drill or anti-non-combat effects. We only really have 3 in the whole deck, which is going to be Black Fatigue and Gallic Gun. Probably not enough. You really need quite a few of these effects, even with the recent nerf to orange, because if you lack on them, the advantage from building up a board of a bunch of allies or a bunch of non-combats or drills really can overwhelm you, because those are cards that stay in play and get you extra benefits every turn. So you sort of break the parity of the fact that both players normally draw 3 cards per turn because you have all these extra effects that are benefiting you. You really need to be able to get rid of them effectively, so we have very few options currently. Next would be our anti-stasis effects. These are cards that are good against combat ending decks that try to get out of combat all the time. We have, I think, 9, because we're up to... We got 2 Trunked Energy Spheres and a Black Negation, which can counteract a lot of combat ending effects that are commonly combat cards. And we have the 2 attacks we added pretty early on, which is going to be, find the dang things, the Fury and the Piercing Beam. For anti-anger, we basically have none. We have exactly Trunks makes himself clear to lower anger, so that's a place that we don't really have very good options. So we need to cut cards, and we potentially even need to add a few more cards to shore up our weaknesses. So the first category I want to remove some cards from is the sort of the worst of the cards that just gain anger. So we have quite a bit, and I think we can shave down that number a little bit and still be able to get to level 4. I'm going to cut the worst ones we have. I want to cut... one Black Hug Maneuver, so down to 2, and I want to cut all 3 Black Feudal Efforts. Next, I want to shave a couple blocks. We do have a lot of defensive effects, so we're going to shave a couple of these. I'm going to cut 2 energy blocks, because as I alluded to, we tend to need less energy blocks than physical blocks. We're going to cut 1 rear spin kick and 1 Black Knife Hand Strike, which is kind of an attack, but it's also a block a lot of the times in this deck. If I can find the dang thing. Maybe I didn't even add it. Blind? Should be 3 of those. What do I get for doing things live? There it is. I'm incredibly blind. Okay, shave down 2 of those. Next, we're actually going to cut a card I gushed about at the beginning of this episode, which is Victorious Drill. Because we're going to be raising our anger and getting off level 1 hopefully pretty early, we're going to lose this card pretty quickly. It means because we're currently struggling for space, normally this card has low opportunity cost, but right now the opportunity cost is the fact that we need to be able to get more cards in here that kill drills, for example. So we do need to cut it from this deck. Many decks won't cut this card even if it's relatively useless because it's so free, but we do need to make some room, and I think it's worth cutting. Alright, next I'm going to kind of shave some of the non-synergy cards, again, the cards that aren't assisting with our 2 main pillars of our deck, get to level 3, remove discard pile cards. First one I'm going to cut is Black Defensive Burst. Shave 1 of those. I'm also going to shave an Exertion and a couple Energy Webs. And the dang thing. Shave 1 of these. We're going to shave 2 Energy Webs and an Exertion. Exertion, notably, is very solid, but because we have some extra damage in the form of some mill effects, it maybe is slightly less important. Plus, drawing multiple, the second copy is less useful than the first, even though it's a decently large attack. We're also going to cut 1 Sphere. I tend to play quite a bit less spheres because our metagame on the NZ server is very, very attack centric, even in standard. If everyone all of a sudden starts busting out control decks and stasis decks, you maybe have to re-up this to do, but we're going to cut him for now. Next, I'm going to sadly cut Gregory, even though I think he's a really neat card in this deck. I think he's maybe, because we don't have good ways of finding him and we can't afford to add them to base, I think he'll be neat if you draw him, but he won't be very reliable, and he can also be clunky because if you draw him on defense, he doesn't do much of opponent's turn. Then the last one we're going to cut is Battle Pausing. This card is a card I end up cutting at the end of a lot of my decks because it has some clunkiness to it. Most importantly in this deck, we have Dying Planet and Hero's Heart is Strong, which remove our own discard pile from the game. They can make Battle Pausing a little awkward. I'm going to cut it for that reason. Down to 76 cards, which means we can add 4 more cards. I'm going to stick 4 other cards in here that will help with some of our weaknesses that we talked about earlier. I'm going to start with 3 Heroic Deeds. This is sort of a catch-all card that can hit lots of different problem cards, from drills to allies to other random non-combats, attach cards, so it's a really, really flexible card. I think it's worth playing 3 of. In this slot, you could also consider playing Bulma's Ultimatum. You need a little bit wider scope on the amount of things you're hitting. Bulma's Ultimatum hits more things, it just doesn't do damage. You need a little bit more damage potentially in this deck. Maybe you find that you're able to get your level 3 and hit them really hard consistently, and you'd rather play Ultimatum instead. That's certainly a possibility, so worth considering. Then the last card is another new card we're going to add, which is going to be Double Might Beam. This is an attack that also can lower your opponent's level multiple times, similar to Cell's threatening position in Villain. And I think it's a chunky enough attack you don't mind playing it in the main deck. Play that one. That rounds out our main deck. Next is the Sensei deck. We've been going for an hour, so I'm going to try and make this quick. Our deck is still weak against combat decks and anger decks, and you usually want to have a little bit of support against ball/stasis decks, so keep all those in mind. So we'll start with Black Pivot Kick. This is probably one of the most played Sensei deck cards because it's Sensei deck only. You have to play it in your Sensei deck if you want to play it at all. It's very flexible because it hits both non-combats and allies. Worth noting that because we aren't discarding a ton of cards from our opponent's hand, that you may not be able to get the second card that frequently with this. But if you time it correctly, often you can. So it's probably still worth playing. Also, it's notably a kick card for our Black Roundhouse. Next is going to be Most decks in Standard should be playing one of these at least. It's good against every ball deck, and if you play it, you usually just win the game against those decks, assuming they can't counter it in some way. Then we have 2 Cell's Presence. Our deck is very weak against allies. Other than the fact that we're not doing that many power stages of damage, you may find that because you're doing mostly life cards, maybe your opponent struggles to lower themselves down to 0 power stages to be able to use all of their allies. And so you may be able to shave or cut this card from the Sensei despite us not having very many anti-ally cards otherwise. We're going to add 2 because it's so powerful if you get it off against those decks. In the last 2 slots, there's a lot of cards I would consider. Barba Sensei, one big drawback is the Sensei deck size isn't huge. So there's some cards I would like to have that we can't. One of the cards I would consider if we were playing a different Sensei or had more room is Black Energy Swirl. This is a really cool card in black decks that care about anger, and it works really well with Torbie because A, it's a 2 anger energy attack, and it's a card that if you know what cards your opponent can have in their deck, you can do things like name one of the only energy blocks that they're likely to be playing, name a word in that card. For example, against red, you might name energy, and then all of a sudden your opponent can't play red energy redirection or red energy defense, which is their 2 main energy blocks that they often play. So that can be really powerful because you essentially prevent your opponent from being able to block your Torbie if you know the cards they're likely to have left in their deck. Because this card is Sensei deck only, we can't play it in the main deck, and you'd have to find room in the Sensei deck for it, which would be pretty hard. If this was main deckable, we could very easily cut something like Black Front Kick or Black Hug Maneuver for it, because it's also 2 anger. You just can't find room in the Sensei deck currently, in my opinion. And then some other cards we would consider would be Freeze's Deception or Kami Fades. I'm going to add 2 Aura Clash. Aura Clash is also a good card against drill decks, and that's usually where I would be senseiing it in, is against drill decks or decks that try to camp their level 1 power, but don't like leveling up. Notably, this deck can 1 through 3 MPPV decks like Roshi, so you may not play it against Roshi, even though it otherwise is normally pretty good, because you might want to try to win via MPPV victory versus decks like Roshi, or versus decks like, say, Ojak, for example. That's why I'm going to put in the Sensei deck. This is a card you might be able to find room for in your main deck, and maybe you shave some of the weaker anger cards, and you get to play both this in your main deck, and you get to play some additional Sensei deck cards like Freeze's Deception, potentially, that are good against drill decks. So that's worth considering for the deck. And with that, that's all. We went a little bit long, but I managed to shave maybe 20 minutes off of the last 2 times I recorded this, so pretty happy with that. And this is the deck. I think, like I said, I tried to lean very heavily into the gimmick of the deck, which is hit them with your level 3 power. You may find that it's a little too inconsistent, so you need maybe more cards or remove cards in their discard pile from the game. You might play cards like Majin Buu's Seal Kick, which I didn't play, but does remove a hefty chunk of cards from their discard pile from the game. Maybe you find that cards like A Hero's Heart is Strong are a little bit one-dimensional, and that you want to play cards that have a little bit more utility like this. But I went this direction because it really leaned heavily into the strategy. That being said, that was our first episode. As I alluded to in the beginning, if you want your deck featured in our Deck Doctor series, on the server, feel free to reach out to me directly on a Discord DM, or you can email nzdeckdoctor@gmail.com. And like I said, include your deck list in an Octagon file and a little blurb about the deck, and I'll be happy to feature you in future episodes.